So we live in a world and in a country that's past and present is inherently violent. We stand on land that is currently stolen land from the Lenape Indians. We walk on streets and we enter buildings that were built by slaves. We attend a university that continues to gentrify and enter neighborhoods surrounding it, displacing its residents. And every other month, another person of color is shot and killed as a result of police brutality. And these are all instances of violence that we think about. And these are all different ways that the institutions around us, we recognize that they were built by white men for white men. And we often think of these institutions as immutable. We think of them as things that we cannot change, and while we might reform or tweak them here and there, that they are ultimately tools of oppression. But one institution that we might not often think of in the same regards as the other are schools. Because schools hold a very personal place for a lot of people, right? Everyone has attended a school, everyone knows someone who's gone to school, and even if you're an immigrant, this concept of schools is something that's very near and dear. And so when thinking about education and thinking about schooling, it's a lot more difficult to recognize the violence within the institution, just because it's something that everyone cares so deeply about. And when I'm saying violence, I don't necessarily mean physical violence, although obviously there have been extremely tragic and horrific acts in schools in the news in recent days. I think about violence in the sense of the ways that interactions occur, and the way that violence is the displacement of people, the way that people feel as though they are lesser in classrooms, the ways that they feel as though they don't have the same opportunities as others, and the ways that they feel as though their voice matters less. And so in thinking about violence in schools, I think about instances by which girls are more likely to drop out of higher math classes than boys because they think that they aren't good enough. I think about the ways that students of color often feel as though they are marginalized in communities and marginalized in classrooms, as though their voice doesn't matter. And I think about the processes by which teachers are often the ones perpetrating this violence, by telling a student that they are a failure, or that they are not smart enough, or that they deserved a bad grade on this assignment because they didn't work hard enough. I think of all of those different things as violence. But I also believe that schools, because they are so uniquely situated, are places that we can reimagine, and are things that we can reimagine through empathy and equity to be places of justice. And this is what I would like to talk to you about today. So let's start by defining terms. Empathy. When I think about empathy in a classroom, I think about all of those different instances and how we can change them. How instead of approaching a situation as one of punishment or one of getting angry at students, we can think of them instead from the perspective of the student. And we think about how we can better support students, how we can think about humanity within classrooms. Behind me is a tree from one of the classrooms that I student teach in. And this tree was created by the students at the beginning of the school year and is called the grit tree. Each student is represented by a bird, and each of the birds, as they fly higher in the tree, represent students overcoming some kind of obstacle. And so I've circled one of the birds because it's relatively low in the tree. And so you might think that this student hasn't overcome obstacles in the way that other 10-year-olds have. You might think that that student is lazier, they're not as hardworking, maybe they're not looking for ways to improve themselves. And what are obstacles that 10-year-olds overcome in the 6th grade? So, for example, I think the bird at the highest was a student who noticed that the back of the classroom was very messy, and without being asked to, they went and cleaned it up. Another student got a B on a paper and then spent every day working hard on it, so the next time they got an A. And so you might think that this student, let's call him Sam, you might think Sam is not working hard. But let me tell you a little bit about Sam. Sam is a student who suffers from depression. He is raised in a single-family household. His mother works 15 hours a day. And while Sam might not be completing all of his assignments, he is picking his sister up from school, and Sam is working on chores in his house. So Sam doesn't necessarily have time to finish his 3-page essay that was requested, and he might be turning in that essay late. But that doesn't mean that Sam is not a valuable student, and it doesn't mean that he's not learning, and it doesn't mean that he doesn't deserve empathy and equity in the classroom. And so I'd like us to think about Sam as we go through the rest of this presentation. Equity. So I'm sure many of you have seen this slide because, I'm sure many of you have seen this slide. It's a slide of the distinctions between equality and equity. So equality is fairness, right? It's treating people fairly. In this image, there's people who are trying to view a baseball game. And in viewing this baseball game, each one of them have been given a block so that they can raise themselves up. But it's not enough. The person at the far right is still unable to see the game, even though he's been given a box to support him. And so that's what equality is. It's treating everyone fairly, but not necessarily looking at the outcomes and seeing if it's made any difference. Equity is different. Equity is saying maybe this person doesn't need a box, and maybe we should give this person 2 boxes to make sure that they can also see the game. So equity isn't actually about doing what's fair, it's about doing what is needed. It's doing what is necessary so that everyone has the same opportunities to succeed in that situation. And so when thinking about schools, we need to think about how we can reimagine them as places of equity through practices of empathy. And what does that look like? So here are a series of maps that I've created, looking at New York City specifically. And this first map is just a very basic map of residential segregation in the city. And you see that there are pockets of deep blue and pockets of light blue. And the deep blue represent areas of deep segregation, and the light blue represent areas where it's majority white people. And so just looking at this map, you might think, okay, black people live with black people, white people live with white people, what's the big deal? The reason why this is important to understand in the context of the rest of this presentation is because what these pockets represent is institutional racism. It represents the ways that institutions and governments have structured our neighborhoods, preventing certain people from living in certain places, and the patterns by which this is reproduced. And so what these neighborhoods and what these lines represent is not something that's natural, but rather that's something that's occurred through practices of violence. And talking about the history of this is a whole nother TED Talk, so I won't go into that. But just keep that in mind as we move through. The next slide is overlaying that original map with a map of school districts. The pink lines indicate school districts, and the bubbles represent where students go to school. And the bubbles represent what the identity of those students are. So it's showing the percentage of minority students by school district. And again, you can see that there's a strong relationship between where students are going to school and where there is residential segregation. And again, you might think this is obvious, that makes sense. But if you know New York City politics, you know that there was a huge push in the early 2000s to have this movement known as school choice. And that school choice was supposed to solve all of these problems. That if students could pick where they went to school, and if they could choose wherever they wanted to go, then segregation would be broken. Now, school choice has existed and continues to exist in districts around the city. And what we can see from this data, which was pulled from this year, is that that story is complicated. Students aren't leaving their neighborhoods, and segregation seems to be extremely persistent. And even in areas that you would perceive to have large segregation in blue areas, those are areas of low socioeconomic status. And so even if there are areas of high minority existence in seemingly unsegregated areas, those areas are still extremely poor. So what does this say about equity in education? This is why this is a problem. It's not just because segregation in itself is bad, because it is, but it's about what that means for students who then go to those schools, how they are treated, and what they get out of their education. Because as you can see, total annual suspensions by schools disproportionately impact students who attend segregated schools. And you might be looking at areas like this and areas like this and saying, oh, but it occurs everywhere. But those are areas that are linked to formerly incarcerated students who are largely minority students who are attending charter schools. And so disproportionately, students of color are impacted by these suspension practices. And disproportionately, they are the ones being kicked out of school. And if you look at the rationale and the reasons behind why this is happening, one of the #1 reasons cited is disrespect. Is this idea that students are being disrespectful to their teachers, or they have an attitude, and therefore they are being kicked out of class. And why this is an issue is not just because of that, but it's because of what mentality that creates then for students. Because 60% of Black and Latinx students have to walk through a metal detector to get to class. And on average, that takes them 40 minutes from entrance of the school building to get to their classroom. Whereas only 12% of white students throughout the city walk through a metal detector. And the rates of success of those metal detectors finding anything is below 0.001%. But what that does do is instill in these minds of these students this idea that they are not good enough, that they are criminals, and that the school believes that they are dangerous and that they don't belong in those spaces. And then, on top of that, when they are suspended and they are removed from the school building, you have this idea that equity in education only belongs to a few people, and that education itself only belongs to a few people. And you might think that these patterns of violence begin with large suspensions or school fights or large actions like that. You might think that students dropping out of school begins with suspension patterns, but they begin a lot sooner, at age 10, with a student like Sam. Last week, I found out that Sam will not be completing the 6th grade. And because he will not be completing the 6th grade as a result of not turning in homework assignments, as a result of whatever caused him to not turn in homework assignments, he will not be completing the 6th grade. He will have to attend summer school, and if he misses one day of summer school, he will be held back. Once students are held back, they are disproportionately more likely to have chronic absenteeism. And once they have chronic absenteeism, they are disproportionately more likely to drop out. And so as we think about that, and we think about the instances that have caused Sam to be put on this path, we realize that violence is not just these large actions, but it's these small actions compounded that work together to strip students of equity. And that's why we need empathy and policies of radical love. And this isn't just a hippy-dippy term that I've created. It comes from philosopher and educator Paulo Freire, who states, "Radical love is never about absolute consensus or unconditional acceptance. Instead, it is unconstructive, rooted in a committed willingness to struggle persistently with purpose in our life, to be lively, forceful, inspiring, and intimately connected to what it means to be human." And that's what schooling should be about, right? If we look at those interactions with Sam and we think about what it would have been like if he went to a classroom that was empathetic, that cared about him as a human being, and if we think of what classrooms would look like if we thought of all students in terms of humanity, we would rethink student-teacher relationships. We wouldn't think of schools as processes by which we separate children into good and bad, smart and dumb, suspended and in school. Instead, we would start thinking about school as a process by which we can learn about our joint humanity, processes by which students and teachers learn from one another, and processes by which schools are places of radical love, where the purpose is not just to fuel out people who will end up in the workforce, who will work in jobs. And it's not just about creating people who will be able to regurgitate facts or get a perfect grade on an exam, but instead creating humans who are compassionate and empathetic, who care about equity in all spaces. And when we create students like that, we get to this, liberation. Because the point should not just be equity. It certainly shouldn't be equality. The purpose should be liberation. It should be able to tear down those fences in every institution and every place so that we can move outside of this realm of thinking about inequalities and instead move to a place where we are constantly evaluating and caring about our joint humanity through processes of equity, empathy, and radical love. Thank you.